Right, everyone. So I know that was a short break, but I promise throughout the day we'll have some longer ones. But you all had some great questions, so keep it going. Our next talk or next speaker is actually going to be Victoria. So a little bit about her. She was drawn to programming because of its potential to help people in a meaningful way. She is a senior Android engineer and author of Android Test-Driven Development by Tutorials. The conferences she has spoken at have been an enjoyable way to connect with the technical community and exchange information with others. In her spare time, Victoria enjoys board games and curling up with a good book. So me too, love board games. All right, so take it away, Victoria, with your talk on internationalization-ing. There you are.
I am. Thank you so much. I'm just arranging my windows so that you all can see them.
You are
Just give me one moment. So it's like tricky to try to share your, present and then share your screen. Okay, here we go. I found it. You can see my slides now.
Yep.
Hello,
awesome.
And thank you so much for coming and watching my talk. Thank you much for the organizers for having me and the sponsors for helping make this possible. I am here working remotely from Chicago, mostly doing Android stuff. And today we're going to be talking about internationalization and what it means to internationalize your app. I originally got interested in internationalization just because I was doing some related things on an app that I was working on and was very curious about it. So not an expert, but something I find very important and very interesting. And I also really like how it kind of relates to accessibility. So what is it? It's the process of getting your app ready for other locales. So structuring your applications in a way that makes them possible to be localized. It's often abbreviated as I-18N because it's the letter I, 18 other letters, and then the letter N because it's a very long word. But what does it mean to localize your app? And this means prepping your app for a specific locale, like maybe Spanish-speaking Americans. It means making an application work for a particular market. So again, that could be people speaking Portuguese in Portugal. It also means supporting right to left in your app, or left to right if you by default support right to left, supporting both text directions. And this is more than just text. It also includes layouts and icons, and we'll look a little bit deeper into what that means later in this presentation. It also means using mindful abbreviations and formats. Not everyone uses the same abbreviations and formats and will understand what you mean when you use a particular one. So this is something to be careful of. We will also talk about how you should watch out for iconography semantics. What do the icons mean that you're using? And is that meaning universal enough for everyone that's using your app? So each of these things we'll dig into a little bit more. I know I breezed through that, so this is kind of an outline of what the talk will be. But before we dive in, let's answer the question, why even internationalize your app? Maybe you think that, oh, right now, like, I'm only catering to people speaking English in the US. And for one, and maybe the most obvious one is it can make it accessible to more people. More people can use it. Even in the United States, not everyone's first language is English. So it just means that more people can use your app and enjoy it and get use from it. And even people who do speak English, it's not necessarily the most comfortable language they're used to speaking in or reading or however they're consuming your app. It can make it more comfortable for them to use. It makes them more likely to use your app versus a competitor. And it makes them more likely to recommend your app to others. It can also make you have a higher quality app. You have to be a lot more intentional when you're doing some things. You have to think more about semantics and meaning. Supporting right to left and longer text can also highlight bad UI. So there's a number of things that by being more intentional about these things, you have a higher quality app. It also saves time later. If you set up your app for internationalization ahead of time, it's a lot easier to add it later on rather than having to go through and redo everything. It's a lot easier to do it from the start than trying to introduce it later. So to dig into those points that I mentioned before, let's start with localization and what does that mean? And like I said, this is preparing your app for a specific market. This is usually one of the most obvious parts of internationalization, and a lot of it is translation. It often requires each of your strings to be referenced from like a string resources file or an object, so then you can have alternatives. For example, on Android, we have a strings XML. We have one that's all in English, another that's maybe all in Spanish, one in German. And there's usually a key, that's the name of the string, and then the value, whatever the value is in that language. And there's alternates for these for all different platforms and languages. The biggest thing for you to think about here is that you should have no raw user-facing strings in your code. They should all be referenced from these files so that they can be translated even if you're not translating them now. But how do you translate them? There's a few different ways that you can approach this. If you're working with a global company and there's people who speak other languages at your company who have the capacity to help you translate things, you can ask them for help and they can help translate your strings. This can be helpful if you don't have the resources to do otherwise, if the list of strings is relatively low, in cases such as that. You can also open source your strings. So any of the strings that you have, there are tools that you can use to open source them. Let the community get involved and help you localize your app and get those translations. And then finally, of course, there's always people willing to translate your app if you pay them. So there are plenty of services out there that you can use that you can upload your strings and people will translate them for you and you can just insert them right into your app. There are many, many services that help you out with translation services. These are just a handful of them. Some of them I've used, some of them I just found with a random Google search, and there's many more. Each of them do something slightly different and have different payment plans. Some of them have free tiers, some of them offer different services. In general, most of them help you manage translations across languages and platforms. So you can see the translations in progress, how many do you have left, what languages you support. There's also translation services, so those services that you can pay for someone to translate your app for you, and plenty of other different things. This is a screenshot of one of them. This is Crowdin. I just pulled this from their docs. You can see there's the list of strings on the left with some indication of what's been translated, a main spot in the center that you can translate things. There's some suggestions as well as comments here. One other thing to note about translating is it's not necessarily always only by language, but you can also do by locale. For example, your translations for Portuguese might be different in Portugal versus in Brazil. And it's up to you if you have the capacity to get that granular in your translations. When you start translating, you need to make sure you don't assume the length of text. Translated text in some languages can be much longer or much shorter than the language that you're testing in. So by not having flexible text views, text can be just cut off. And this could be both with the length and the number of new lines. So keep that in mind when you're building your UI. Also keep in mind that even if you have truncation, some languages have words that can get longer when truncated. So keep that in mind as well. By making these views flexible as well with the size that they can be, you can also better support text scaling for accessibility. So that's one more ADA compliance thing that is taken care of at the same time. Another thing to note when you are doing localization is that some languages don't use upper or lowercase letters. So if you're doing any manipulation of text, make sure you take the locale into account, as well as any other string manipulation things. All right, abbreviations and formats. So not everyone knows and uses the same abbreviations. I know so many of us have run across an abbreviation on the internet and we're like, what does this mean? Now I feel silly, and I know I'm not one of those hip young kids anymore because I don't know what these abbreviations mean and I have to Google it. Try not to do that to your users. There are lots of people and reasons who might not know what the abbreviation is. So if you have an abbreviation, make sure you explain it, but it's a lot clearer if you just don't use them. Also watch out for idioms and cultural norms. A lot of these will be very specific to a location, and there are lots of people who might not understand the idiom. So try to use clear language when you can, especially if what you're trying to convey is critical. So try to make that clear, avoid idioms when you can, and try to use clear, plain language. When you're trying to check for this, try to read things literally to kind of help you understand if something is an idiom. Some things that you might not even realize are idioms jump out when you start doing that. Like if you're trying to wrap your head around this, you might hurt your head because this is a hard topic. Anyway, moving on. People also prefer different formats and understand different formats. So people might put the month first when they're writing a date, and some might put the date and then the month. There are different time formats, different calendars, starts of the week, ways of formatting addresses, names. When possible, lean on the formatting tools built into your framework or your language. These often take locales into account. So if you're saying, hey, give me a short formatted date, it will take the locale into an account so that it follows the user's locale. And then when possible, with such things as names, try to be as flexible as possible. Not everyone's name fits into first name, last name. If you can, do maybe full name and what should I call you, so that people can put in their name in the way that their name is formatted. When you can, display the user's currency as well. This isn't always possible. Like if there's a store, the conversion rates for currency is always changing. If you can give an approximation, you'll get your message across a lot easier. You'll lessen the cognitive overhead for your user and just make it a smoother experience. This one's a bit trickier, but if it's something that you can do, it's a little bit nicer for your user. Another big thing is supporting right to left. So in English, when we're writing something out, we start at the left, and as we add letters, we move to the right. Some language are flipped. You start at the right and move to the left. And this isn't only for text. It's also a mental model. So start and end are flipped and back and forward. So in English or left to right languages, we might think that an arrow facing left on the left side of the screen is a back arrow. When supporting right to left, you'd want that reversed to be pointing the opposite way on the opposite side of the screen. So lots of things that you need to consider here. There's supporting right aligned text. This often happens pretty automatically in apps and frameworks. Just be prepared if you support user-generated content, if there could be a mix. I have a longer version of this talk that kind of goes into how to do that. That's in the link that I posted in the chat if you want to look more into that. You also want to reverse parts of the layouts in breadcrumbs. I mentioned once with the back button that you need to flip what side of the screen. Also consider other things like breadcrumbs. Instead of going left to right, you want to flip the direction and do right to left. This applies to a lot of different parts of your UI. Also, lean into using start and end over left and right when your framework supports it, whatever you're using for your UI. It makes this reversal a lot easier. Then you don't have to kind of think about both layouts at the same time. You just have to think about this should be towards the start of the screen, whether the start is right or left for that user. Also, make sure that you're paying attention to icons, especially icons showing text and direction. I mentioned the back arrow that might need to be flipped. Same as with like undo, but not left. Left always points to the left, so keep that in mind. Think about the semantic meaning of things. You can't just blindly reverse icons. Pay attention to what the meaning is and what is in the icon. If there's, say, text in the icon, you can't just flip that because then the letters will be backwards and you don't want that. There's a couple ways that you can force right to left in your browser, on your device, if you want to without changing the language. And you do want to test these things because otherwise your smile might turn upside down. If you want to learn how that could happen, feel free to check out this talk. I find it very, very interesting. The link to it is in that link that I shared in the chat as well. All right, with our last few minutes, let's look at iconography semantics. So think about the icon meeting and let this influence what the icon should look like, how it's labeled. I'll go back to that example that does this arrow mean left or does it mean back? And let that influence how you reverse it, what it looks like, how you might label it. Also, keep in mind that symbols might not mean the same thing in all cultures. So you might think that something is a universal symbol, but second guess yourself when you start thinking this. It might not be the case. When you have icons with currency or letters, watch out for those if you're using a $ to signify money. Maybe it's a place that you can use the user's local currency symbol to mean the same thing and make it clearer for them. Lots of things to keep in mind. You can use the user's alphabet. If you have like an ABC button, you could use it to change it to be the user's alphabet if you want that flexibility and to increase that clarity. And then finally, here's some ways to test these things. You can change the language in your browser or on your device. You can force right to left. You can run your UI tests in other locales. And then you can also ask someone from another part of the world or who speaks another language to try out your app. They'll know the best if something's kind of weird. You also want to try to make sure your app is consistent across platforms. It can get confusing if something behaves a little bit differently across platforms. Here's some great links that you can check out if you're interested in digging a little bit more deep into this. And with that, I want to thank you very much for listening. I don't know if we have much time for questions, but we can look.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk, Victoria. That was awesome. I learned a lot. Yeah, if anyone has any, please throw that in the QA. We've got a couple of minutes, I'd say, before we have to go to our next talk. But one thing that I wanted to ask you, because I do like product design at my job.
Mm-hmm.
The hardest things is like convincing a project manager to like expend more resources or time into something. So what would you say to a project manager, like coming at them that this is something, you know, that is worthwhile and, you know, worth investing into the project?
Yeah. Probably the two biggest things. There's plenty of other little things, but the two that come to mind that might be the biggest is one, it's a huge opportunity for growth. You're able to grow the market, who you can market the app to. So there's a huge opportunity for growth there. It's also a huge amount of time saving later on. Even if you're not interested in growing that market now, if it ever comes up later, it's going to save a lot of time later on if you spend a little bit of time on it now. And there's like plenty others you can look at, kind of what motivates the person that you're talking to. Is it growing the app? Is it, I don't know, user happiness? Because if it's like user happiness, think about it's more comfortable for people to use the app in a way that's more natural for them, for their locale. So those are probably like the top things that I would say.
Yeah, awesome. I will keep that in mind. Oh, we got one QA. Groups you connect with online to develop your skills.
Oh, yes. I don't have many specifically for internationalization. I am very like connected on LinkedIn and Twitter. I also have a few Slack groups that I'm in. I'm in, I think, like 3 different Chicago tech groups. So yeah, I just kind of find the people like in the little like tech communities that I'm in to grow those skills, ask questions there, and do that, plug into the communities that I'm already part of there.
Awesome. Oh, okay, we got one from the last talk too. What do you know now that you wish you knew sooner?
Oof. It can be a lot harder to convince people to spend time on this than you might expect. Once you, like, the more you dig into it, the more and more it feels very important. But as you mentioned, it can be hard to convince people. So it's finding ways to make sure it's scalable. You don't have to spend a whole bunch of time on it. Figuring out ways to get it in the existing process so it's not like a burden. So that's something that I think I wish that I had known before like jumping into this.
Awesome. All right. Grant asked, how much of a linguist do you need to be?
I'm not a linguist like at all. I'm just like kind of trying to learn Spanish. But yeah, most of the things that like, if you get something wrong, your users will tell you, I promise you. And then you can fix it. But if you are more of a linguist, you can do more of the stuff on your own. If you're less of a linguist, you might be asking more questions, Googling more things, outsourcing some things. But really, I think as long as you're willing to like learn, you don't need to be a linguist.
Cool. All right. And then have you tracked the ROI or return on investment so as to pitch it to the project managers or PMs early and showing them the business case for the return later?
I honestly have not, so I don't have a good answer for that.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's cool. All right. Any other questions coming in then? I think we're good. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Victoria.
Thank you.
Learned a lot. So for everyone else, I think we're going to take, let's see, it's 1:24. So we're going to take the next 6 minutes for a break and then be back at 1:30. Jennifer Wadella will be speaking on how there are no snow days when you work remote. So stay tuned for that. And then make sure that you're also filling out the feedback survey. So then that way we can always just improve our future talks, and it enters you or gives you another chance to win a prize at the end. So otherwise, see you all soon. Thank you again.